time for that.
Give or take.
Yeah. I may be.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the workshop section of the monthly board manager meeting. For the record, we have 4 managers present. I believe Jill is still coming. She's just late. And I think at this point, I probably will turn it over to Terry to give us an idea of what we're up for next.
President Pedersen, managers, tonight, Minnetonka, and their consulting engineer, is asked to present on the Excelsior Boulevard project, which is a rather large project. It goes both Minnehaha Creek and Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District. I think we had our first meeting about 9 months ago, a year ago now. Met and talked about different options and things they're doing it. They asked for an opportunity to present to the board before submitting the formal application and to get the feedback from it. I thought it would be a good idea. I think we've had great success with Chanhassen and the conversations that we've had beforehand. Eric Ekman, who's with the city of Minnetonka, Roberta and Mike are here as well. And they, in the steering committee, Eric has been a member of the steering committee and has been working really hard as well to try and come up with ways that we can work better together, gaps and overlaps. So with that, unless Engineer Sobiek has anything they'd like to add, I would just like to turn it over to them right away so that they can present.
Thanks, Terry. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So thanks to everybody for giving us this opportunity to give you a little update on the Excelsior Boulevard project. I'm just going to give you kind of a high-level overview and walk you through how we're approaching this project as we're starting design. See if it lets me page down. Maybe not. That way. All right. So the project location, as Terry mentioned, we start at County Road 101 and we extend all the way to Eden Prairie Road. So only half of the project is located within the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District. The boundary is right at Holiday Road, which is right about in the middle. And the road itself is a county roadway, so it's County Road 3. So the Hennepin County is a partner in this project as well as the city of Minnetonka. The roadway corridor right now has a lot of aging pavement. There's no curb and gutter. It's very kind of spotty. There's some places where there's curb and then curb cuts that discharge directly to the adjacent waterways and wetlands. There's no sidewalk or trail along this segment of the roadway. So, and the shoulders are very narrow, so there's some maintenance and some safety improvements and concerns associated with this segment of Excelsior Boulevard as well. Proposed improvements is going to include full pavement reconstruction and adding curb and gutter along the whole length of the corridor. In addition, we're adding a 6-foot shoulder and an 8-foot trail on both sides of the corridor. There's several intersection improvements that go along with that, including adding a few roundabouts for some traffic safety reasons. And then drainage and water quality improvements that go along with that full reconstruct and the conversion to an urban section. Additionally, there's some other utility water main improvements, overhead utilities that are getting undergrounded, and some other associated utility replacement with the construction. So from a water resources protection standpoint specifically, we're including trail buffers along the pedestrian trail on both sides everywhere that we can to try to maximize that green space and disconnect those impervious surfaces. Additionally, we do have a lot of adjacent wetlands that we're doing corridor alignment adjustments to try to minimize impacts to existing wetlands and avoid impacts or maximize buffer widths. And in some areas where it gets really tight and we can't adjust the alignment, then we're going to retaining walls to minimize those impacts to adjacent wetlands. And then ultimately incorporating stormwater BMPs and treatment where there isn't any today. So the existing roadway discharges without any treatment in most locations. From a stormwater management perspective, we're going to be looking at volume reduction, maximizing green space and green infrastructure, and using infiltration where we can, where it's appropriate. We do have some component or some portions of this corridor that are within a DWISMA where we can infiltrate, but we're going to infiltrate everywhere that it's feasible to do so. And then anywhere that we can't do volume reduction and utilize infiltration, then we're going to go to a filtration BMP as our next kind of level of treatment. And in some cases, we may be required to go underground with some of that, but still utilizing a filtration BMP for stormwater treatment of the runoff from the project corridor. There is a few variances and exceptions that we are anticipating as part of this project right now. It's pretty typical for linear projects like this to have variances related to those minimum wetland buffers because our corridor is fixed and the wetlands are really tight to that existing corridor. So we're minimizing everywhere that we can, utilizing retaining walls to maximize that available buffer width, but we might not hit the minimums everywhere along this whole corridor. So we're anticipating when we do come in for our permit application, having some discussion about variance for that particular wetland buffer rule. Additionally, we are tracking whether or not we will need an exception for rate control. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, there's multiple discharge locations where we have curb cuts along the corridor. And so where we have maybe 3, 4, 5 curb cuts that discharge to a wetland, in our proposed configuration, we would collect all that into one singular outlet, route it through a stormwater BMP, and then discharge it to the same wetland. So we aren't able to do a one-to-one on discharge locations necessarily, so we may or may not need to talk about an exception for the rate control rule. Currently, I think we have it worked out to not need an exception, but we're still early in design, and so that might come up as we work through the design process. We're anticipating that that could be something we talk about later this year as well. The other thing that I wanted to point out is this segment of Excelsior Boulevard is right at the entrance to Purgatory Park. And so I'm going to turn it over to Eric to talk a little bit about some potential partnership ideas and opportunities.
Yeah, I get to talk about the fun stuff, right? So thanks, Roberta. Eric Ekman, Water Resources Manager at the City of Minnetonka. I'm also one of the city representatives on the 10-year plan steering committee. So I've been working with Terry and the staff and other cities and other agency partners on the 10-year plan, providing input, being engaged. And in the spirit of working on the plan, we've talked a lot about early communication, collaboration, looking for opportunities. I've only been with the city for under a year. So as soon as I found out about this project, I approached Terry right away and said, this is a big transformational project that's happening in the watershed. When you're taking a county road corridor and you're going from sort of a rural section with maybe doesn't have great bike and ped facilities, and you're upgrading that and modernizing that, there's challenges, right? There's impacts, but there's also a lot of opportunity when it comes to stormwater management, protecting and preserving resources, things like that. And so here we have this county road corridor, this sort of east-west corridor with a lot of history with the old Excelsior Boulevard, the streetcar line a century ago with a lot of impacts back, years ago. And now we're modernizing that corridor. We've got the transportation corridor itself, where we're doing some stormwater improvements, trying to protect the water resources. And then you've got the green corridor with Purgatory Creek that intersects Excelsior Boulevard just to the west of Purgatory Park, which is kind of pictured here on this slide. And so there's a couple opportunities that we have. We know we need to try to meet the watershed's rules, and that you regulate projects and development like this. But is there some way for you to plug in that meets your current or future needs, goals, and the plan you're working on, either for above and beyond treatment or some other enhancement or education or interpretation or something? We think that there's definitely opportunity to plug in along this Excelsior Boulevard corridor itself. And then also in Purgatory Park, this is the entrance off of Excelsior Boulevard, just east of Purgatory Creek, is the entrance to Purgatory Park. I don't know if any of you have been there, but that is one of our flagship parks in Minnetonka. It's one of the most widely used, highly valued parks. The visibility and usership is going to increase with this county road improvement project. with the trails and bike lanes and things that we're adding. So there's going to be a lot more use and exposure and visibility here. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, not only with this transportation corridor project, but also with our park planning that we're doing. It's somewhat separately, but we're trying to integrate that a little bit here too. So I don't know if some of you have been by there. There's a red barn. You can see it on the left photo there, or plan sheet. It shows a red barn in red. We call it the Red Barn site. The city purchased that property a few years back and did some master planning of the park. And we're officially incorporating that site into the park here this summer. So we're doing some planning around that, around possibly moving the restroom facilities and parking lot that's deeper in the park, moving it out towards the roadway corridor, a little closer to the Red Barn site, using that site, trying to understand, like, we're going to do a feasibility study this summer, which I hope you can be engaged in that. And I'll talk to our Parks and Trails manager some more about that, about how you can plug in to providing input or time and resources into helping, plan this park area. But again, if we do some improvements there, we know we're going to need to do some stormwater management, protect some of the resources there, maybe restore some resources that were once degraded back when the streetcar went through. But there's definitely some opportunities for you to plug in. One of the things I noticed when I went out there recently was if you just drive by on Excelsior Boulevard quickly and you kind of aren't looking around too much, you don't even notice that Purgatory Creek is there. This is the headwaters, at least the Minnetonka headwaters of Purgatory Creek, with a lot of wetlands up in the northern area. A lot of drainage flows through this area. It's important resource, and you don't really know it's there. There's no signage that says Purgatory Creek or welcome to Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed or anything. So I think at a minimum, there's something I think that could be done to just bring more prominence to the creek and show its importance, the value of water and why this is important. But then plugging in on some more, I think, because we're looking at what can this park be, what kind of education, programming, interpretive signage, other things, what can we do here, and how can we let stormwater be an amenity and a feature, or something to feature rather than something to just, hide underground or to just, build something and walk away. We want people to kind of, see it, value it, learn from it. And so there's some opportunities to plug in. We just want to kind of gauge your interest a little bit tonight and let you know about this opportunity. You don't have to make any decisions or anything, but that there will be more opportunities to continue the conversation, both with the transportation corridor project and with the park planning and feasibility study that we're doing this year. So with that, stand for questions, or like maybe you have a couple more
just a
slides.
couple more slides. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, the intent is just to get your wheels turning a little bit there. Just a quick update on schedule. We're in design right now for the Excelsior Boulevard project. Permits we're expecting towards the end of summer, beginning of fall, bidding early in 2027 for construction next year. So that's the current schedule that we're anticipating for that Excelsior Boulevard improvement. And if you are interested to follow along or get updates on it as more information becomes available, the city's website has a place where you can sign up for updates. So if anybody's particularly interested, you can certainly sign up for updates or check in on it on the city's website as well. And then if you have other questions, Terry, I think, has these slides as well, but the City of Minnetonka, you can reach out to Mitch Hatcher, Hennepin County, because again, it's a county partnership program. Drew McGovern or Bolton and Mank is doing the design, so you can reach out to Mike Waltman or ask him some questions. He's here with us today as well as the project manager for that project on the civil side. And then if you have water resources specific questions, reach out to Eric or Drew McGovern again from Hennepin County, or you can reach out to myself, Roberta Cronquist at Bolton and Mank, and we're happy to answer any questions as well. With that, I'll open it up to any of you for questions. Go ahead,
I
Jill.
always have questions. So when you say curb and gutter, I get real nervous because I'm a person sees that as a channel, and I'm real into realizing that the water cycle, we're not cycling. We're sending it to the Gulf constantly. We're taking out, total suspended solids and phosphorus and stuff. But, so Eric, the protection of resources, and you were going fast, Rebecca. Go ahead. So I'm just trying to wrap my arms around how we can get infiltration, and how we, if you're sending water to the wetland, are we doing it in a way that doesn't degrade the wetland, can help restore transpiration, so we're cooling the atmosphere and helping our climate environment, as well as, I mean, I love the idea of collaboration, so I just was trying to figure out how we can do a win-win here.
Yeah, and right now the corridor is already discharging to those wetlands untreated, right? So as far as protecting the resources, we're going to be definitely improving pollutant removal from what's there today, because right now there isn't any, right? But right now, where we have multiple discharge locations, we're collecting that into a more traditional storm drains system that will route through, ideally an infiltration BMP, but there are some places where we can't infiltrate that water due to other reasons, right? Whether it's in a DWISMA or we have high groundwater. There's some places where infiltration just isn't feasible. Those locations then will do more traditional filtration treatment, but our first goal is to infiltrate, to maximize green space, and then to infiltrate runoff wherever we can.
So if you're collecting all that, you're concentrating heavy metals and all the other crud that's coming off the road into whatever it's going to. Opportunities for microbial activity to break down a lot of that stuff, because we're learning more about how they can do that. But that takes good soil health and trees and vegetation to let nature play its part to do something really healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's where I'm coming at, not to put barriers up, but can we work with nature to make this a cutting edge opportunity to show that we can work with nature and make things better?
Yeah, and that's why we're looking to you for ideas and partnership and things like that, because there's certain minimums we can meet, right? But then there's above and beyond, what are some other impairments or needs or pollutants that you're looking to address? And do you as a watershed want to help plug in on that and provide, ideas, guidance, resources, whatever that happens to be?
Well, and
I'm a big believer in treatment trains if you can do it. There's all
Mhm.
those different processes that you try to put in place, biological, chemical, physical, to try to strip out pollutants and nutrients in a tight corridor that's competing for space, and where we're making safety improvements for bicyclists, pedestrians, users of all ages and abilities. It's hard to fit everything in there. And with other constraints, whether it be groundwater, utilities, WISMA, drinking water areas, things like that. It can be a challenge, but
I totally get
Mhm.
that part.
Eric, I think Manager Duval has a
I
question.
have a question also. So I live on the southwest corner of the park, and it is one of the best parks, and I think it's one of the biggest parks in the metro area. And it gets a lot of use, and it connects into the Edenbrook Conservation Area, Purgatory Creek, and it's almost a similar size area. So it's a fantastic connection between the city of Minnetonka and Eden Prairie and our watershed. So the question I have doesn't relate necessarily to what we're talking about, but it's been really a controversial park relating to dogs, and it seems like dogs are taking over. So I'm curious how they might fit in, because it seems like they have a run of the park now and people don't pick up. And so if we have more dog traffic, it seems like that, we're potentially drawing more negative into the ground and into the groundwater. And anyway, just curious if there's any notion how dogs fit into it, and the park general planning for that
Mhm.
purpose as a park, as opposed to the water issues.
Mhm.
Most of the times, the value added is well. Our cost share program. Basically, the order of budget process right now. That's what it's on.
That's right. And this park area was master planned. And now I think some concepts were developed and we're moving into more feasibility study of what could be, you know, what's the vision, what are the goals, what could we do in this park? And really putting a point on it. So I think there's definitely opportunity to plug in during that engagement process this summer. And I don't know a lot about, I'm not working on the dog park side of things as much, or the off-leash dogs. I think they have to be leashed right now. But I know that when you make these improvements within a park and you have trails and just more activity and more people visiting, a lot of times just having more eyes and usership can help reduce, and there's that peer pressure to help reduce people, you know, taking their dogs off leash or not picking up the waste because someone's watching. So I think it's a little bit isolating right now in some areas, but I think that could change a little bit where there's a little bit more eyes on folks.
Manager Nelson, you have another comment.
So again, all of, collaboration is good. I'd be curious how, if you talk to Manager Jeffries about like what capital projects we might have and how they would coordinate, our scoring system for projects. I would look to see what, above and beyond, obviously, the requirements to get a permit. So, and I noticed like on some of your schematics, it was, the sidewalk with the curb and gutter and the green turf are you looking at things that don't look like what you think of as a typical urban cross section? Are we changing what you expect to see? Just mowed grass, or are we going to let it be, fescues or something like that? Because infiltration, I think, Manager Crafton brought that up, is definitely sort of an above and beyond, but just overall everywhere. And changing how urban, suburban people see the landscape around them.
Yeah, and I think there's some considerations because it is also a county road. They have their
there's a lot of
standards as well, right? That they want to see, and so trying to find out ways for all of those things to fit together is really the challenge, right?
So the comment I have is that in listening to you talk about all of this, clearly there was a lot of thought that went into it. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you're actually here sitting and talking to us, this is the first time I can remember this happening in literally years. So I would first like to say thank you very much for actually coming and talking to us and including with us, that we can actually partner with you to make this a great project. You've already got, the semblances of here's what the project is really going to be, and it's going to be good. But the fact you're here and asking for our hand with it, that's a pretty swell deal. So first, thank you very much, because I appreciate that ever so much. I'm sure that we're going to be able to find ways in which to work with you. The fact that we can partner with you, whereas before we were all these little separate entities all marching and doing our own thing, we can get a whole lot more done if we work together. So from my heart, thank you very much. Any other comments or questions?
So when you got tight places like what you're talking about, totally respect that. But is there a way, if we're looking at water balance, is there a way within the park then to promote more of the transpiration to counter off any of the challenges in the area that you got to work with? I totally get that. So I guess I just wanted to get that at the table, because it's something I see constantly. So.
And one of the other things, and maybe Mike, you have more insight on this too, there's we're looking at other sustainability related metrics as well, right? So like tree avoidance, for example, there's a lot of mature trees. And so we're working to try to find ways to not impact any more trees than we need to. And so there's an entire separate sustainability study that's kind of being done in parallel as well, to see how we can quantify some of the things that we're doing to encourage pedestrian traffic. Right now people have to get to the park using cars, and so by creating other non-motorized modes to get there can enhance some of that. So I think there's a lot of layers to this project. Kind of going back to what Eric was saying earlier about it being really like a generational project, because it's going to really change how this whole corridor feels. And so there is a lot of opportunity there on a lot of different levels to look at
When
benefits.
COVID hit Bloomington, people were in the parks constantly, so I'm excited about this opportunity. I think it's a great project.
Scott, you have a question or comment?
Real quick question, don't expect a full answer, but what have you thought about for chloride management? This is a corridor, it's right up against the creek, there's valuable wetlands, and head out there, let's put our hats on and see
Yep.
how we can get creative with chloride management.
100%. Yep. So low salt is already a focus for the city and as part of this project as well. I don't have specifics to tell you, but but yes, it's already on our radar. So we're on the same page, Scott.
Yeah, another way to.
Yes. Or her team, yeah.
Super.
And of course, it's a county roadway,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but the county's an integral partner with all of this, and
Yes.
they have resiliency sustainability group and things like that, and it's
Well,
important
thank
to.
you again very much for coming to visit.
Thank you very much for the time. I know we probably chatted longer than we.
Hey, it's a complicated project. How much time have you already put in on those?
Right, but I know you have lots to talk about today. So.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yes. Absolutely.
That the resources have to also achieve the goals that the watershed district.
Right.
I mean, that's a sign at a minimum, I think.
Oh, yeah. No sign at Purgatory Creek. I was like, really?
I feel like a sign should be okay.
This might be a good project for looking at this update. Very good. Talk about your house. Creative.
Oh, that's true.
Or that's why I brought up the scoring system and how we
Mhm.
prioritize our capital projects. And we're not the ones to have that conversation with as much as Terry is, but how it fits in with it. So if it doesn't rise to that level, it's harder to,
Right.
you know.
And even if I may, with your peak scoring that you have for prioritizing, the CRAS, way up in the upper part of the watershed, a stream like this might have a lower priority, even though you have maybe a phosphorus impairment, you're concerned about chlorides, you're concerned about coli and macroinvertebrates, within the watershed and downstream. Those are things, we'll be looking at, again, rules meeting minimums, but we maybe don't have a specific eye on any one of those things, and maybe you do. And again, it might be a lower priority in terms of all the other streams and reaches, but this is an opportunity to protect and preserve this resource. And our park and trail manager said if there's ever a location in Minnetonka within this watershed that you could partner on and have a big benefit, it would be here with this park, because there's not a lot of other opportunities within our city for you to plug in to have this kind of impact. And then I think there's already some investment with the watershed because this creek re-meander project is happening deeper in the park to the south. So there's already sort of a presence, some investment, but it's not out near Excelsior Boulevard where, again, there's the entrance to the park. We're going to be looking to do some improvements there. This is the transportation corridor, but then off of that, the park improvements. This is an opportunity, without a sign. There's no sign right now that says Purgatory Creek, but we could draw people in and show them this water's important and here's why, and here's what we're doing about it. And I think there was a lot of disruption when the streetcar came through a century ago. There's some things we can do to help restore that within the park as well, potentially, like connecting wetlands to the stream, to the creek better, enhancing drainage ways, connecting floodplain, creating floodplains. So I think there's multiple benefits, including, ecosystem, ecological benefits with native plantings and trees and other things. So I think the sky's the limit on some of this.
So I guess, Terry, that means that from hearing what we all have to say, we are very much in favor of you working to make this happen, work as a collaborative partner with them. So,
Minnetonka's got such good staff.
yeah, you do.
I
have
keep getting
great
these
staff.
Minnetonka resilience, it's like, I'm on that wavelength and I keep getting all of that information. Christine Peterson's doing an amazing
Mhm.
job Yeah, so it's exciting.
This is where.
Yep, do remember that. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the time.
Manager, I would recommend that in this break. Food. Out and people entertain you with their. what they- Thank you.
We're gonna
Okay.
get food now.
Get food now. Yes, food now.
Are we still recording or?
The one thing they are gonna.
Be good to be clear when we are in art. For me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Here. Oh, no worries. That's okay.
It's like.
He's a nice guy.
Does it make sense? Should we start thinking about managing nitrogen? You do this a lot in agricultural watersheds. What about a suburban watershed? What about an urban watershed? Should we think about that? So we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about flood storage. Biodiversity, we really kind of transform that into wetland restoration. What's the role of wetlands in connecting to the lakes in terms of all these functions? So biodiversity is one of those functions that we'll look at, and I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but we're really talking about that nutrient cycling. How do the wetlands connect? What role do they have in functioning along with the lakes that they're connected to? And then we have to keep in mind that these are recreational lakes. People want to recreate on them. But that really gets into the aquatic plant management and the in-lake management more so than the watershed stuff. Okay, so what stressors are we talking about? Well, we know we have a lot of impervious surface. Coming with the impervious surface comes changes to hydrology, excess nutrients, not just phosphorus, but excess nitrogen. I'm going to show you that these lakes are nitrogen enriched. Even though they're nitrogen enriched, they're still acting like a lot of other lakes, but I do think that might be having some impact on the overall productivity of these lakes. Why we see so much algae, why we see so many plants in these lakes might be related somewhat to nitrogen. And then toxic contaminants. We can't cover all of them, but chloride is the one that's really a hot topic right now. So if we start thinking about chloride, road, and impervious runoff from parking lots, all those other things can go with it, and we can connect those dots later as we start to think about all of it. Unnatural hydrology and flooding, you know, we're connected by pipes and wetlands. We've plumbed the whole system to prevent flooding, and that can have some impacts. Okay, so it's watershed nutrient cycle is a big part of what we're talking about here. And you're going to look at maps that look like this, which we really just have a lot of subwatersheds divided so that they go to each pond, wetland, or whatever device. You'll hear me use the word device. It's a modeling term. But we're talking about a pipe or something like that and how we connect all those dots and then how those drain into the system. And you can see that some of these subwatersheds drain more nutrients in the lakes than others. So, you know, one might be a couple subwatersheds coming into Susan are 92 pounds and 78 pounds of phosphorus. This helps us kind of piece apart what parts of the watershed are most important for restoration, and where should we focus our efforts. So let's start with hydrology. We wanted to understand how these lakes are functioning hydrologically first before we got into all the nutrient stuff, okay? So the first thing we did is we just looked at the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District Regional Groundwater Study. Scott, I lost the date on this. 2017. This is done in 2017. And you're kind of in this sitting up on the plains of the Minnesota River, where most of the watershed district in general drains down towards the Minnesota River, right? And there's some sandier areas. I live up on the bluff, or close to the bluff, and it's very sandy where I am. My soils are very sandy. But so it's sandier in some areas and not in others. But all of these water bodies were categorized in these different types of wetlands, whether it's a discharge, lake, or wetland, recharge, flow through, perched. Okay, and so what I want to show you is that if we look at Lucy and Ann, they sit over here in this perched area. And what do I mean by perched? It means that they're more than 25 feet above the typical groundwater table. So all the water that comes in the lake, when it leaves, it's working its way towards the groundwater table. It's not interacting with it. The groundwater table is never coming up high enough to interact with that lake. So it's perched up above the groundwater table, and mostly it's going to be flowing out. Any water that comes in or comes out from groundwater is going to be flowing out of the lake. And that's important when we think about how does chloride move through groundwater into these lakes, right? It might be localized in here, but in general, the groundwater is not connected in a way that's really going to make us believe that chloride would move into the lake from groundwater. So it's mostly going to be from surface runoff. Okay, and that's important for us when we think about it. When you get into Susan, Susan sits more into what they call a recharge lake. It means it's predominantly losing water to the groundwater table, but it does interact with the groundwater table. So it's not perched so high above it. There are times when the groundwater table will come up and intersect with the bottom of the lake, and you can get some groundwater exchange. So it's more at risk at some groundwater pollutants coming in, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, or chloride. And then when you get into over here into Mitchell and into Red Rock, then they're definitely recharge lakes and they're more vulnerable lakes. And I'll talk about that because they interact much more with the groundwater table. But the short answer is right now and how they're functioning today is they're all losing water to the groundwater table. Predominantly. That's the main. And that's important when we think about how does groundwater flow in and out, bringing phosphorus or some of those. So I'll come back around to that. So we look at that vulnerability here. You can see that Anne and Lucy sit over here in Perch. They're not vulnerable. When you get into Susan, it's a little more vulnerable. And then Red Rock and Mitchell were considered vulnerable. These are all recharge lakes. These are perched lakes. And then the vulnerability is over here on the right-hand side. Okay. And we won't go too much into vulnerability, but those are the lakes that I would start thinking about groundwater. How is groundwater influencing the lake? How does groundwater influence water level? And then how does that affect the overall lake function? Whereas the other lakes, we don't have to worry about it as much. And then we looked at flooding. You guys have done a great job at flooding. There's not a lot of flooding issues in the watershed, right? And so we wanted to look at, though, like when we start thinking about projects, we start thinking about connections, is what's the importance of some of the areas around these lakes or the lakes themselves, or are there structures that are at risk? And so here we just took the 100-year flood inundation and at-risk structures. So these yellow structures are ones that at 100-year flood elevation could be impacted. Correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, you're the expert here, right? And then some of those flood storage areas. So you can see for Lake Lucy, there is that wetland area down here that's really important for flood storage. If that were to go away and get developed or something happens in that wetland, you could lose that flood storage. That could change some of those flood components. So when we think about projects and we think about what we want to do for the lake, we're trying to have this context of where's the major storage occurring in the watershed, so we can be careful with that, and are there opportunities maybe to do something about these structures while also stacking water quality benefits and some of those other things. That's a great question for the administrator.
So can you go back to that? So if you remember that, we had a project actually in the north corner of the city where we were in an underground structure underneath. We're able to get all the property owners back, but as part of the project, looking at storage. That is something I think in the larger picture when we get to this, just need to start talking about when we talk about value of resources, or to get overlaid there.
And it adds some challenges to what we're doing too. This is Mitchell and Red Rock. One of the watersheds you're going to see me highlight is we're sitting right here, right now in this building, and drains to this pond, drains across the road and through this whole complex of ponds and wetlands before it goes into Mitchell Lake. This is a high loading subwatershed, right? There's a lot going on in the subwatershed, but it's also a subwatershed that's prone to some flood issues. There are structures that are at risk. So we're going to have to think hard about when we do a project through here, how do we balance the flood risk with the water quality impacts and other things that are in there? Okay.
Slow it down, spread it out.
If we can, right? We want to find those opportunities. We're not going to be able to dive into every opportunity in this study. The idea is to identify what parts of the watershed can we make the most impact. Right. And this watershed coming into Mitchell is becoming one of those subwatersheds where we can try to make the most impact. And then it's up to Scott to work his magic to figure out how to restore the flooding issue. And then I work my magic on the water quality. Right. And we try to figure out how do we piece all this together. And then you have a project. You have a project that has multiple functions associated with it that can be long-term beneficial. Okay, so I won't read all these, but really there's, we know that the lakes that are perched, we know which ones are connected to groundwater. That helps us understand the functioning. And the other thing that was interesting was there was, as a part of that study, I don't know what you would call these, good infiltration areas that where infiltration would work. Oh, this is Red Rock Lake here and Mitchell's up here. There's a lot of infiltration ability around Red Rock Lake. And so when we think about Red Rock Lake being vulnerable to water drawdown, being connected to the groundwater, infiltration projects make sense in that part of the watershed. So part of what we're looking for is, can we promote somehow infiltration in that part of the watershed to support the water table in that region? And talking to the groundwater folks, because they know more about this than I do. Okay, and then we're also pulling in recommendations from that study where I don't want to get into this because this is not my area of expertise, but really establishing a monitoring well network. We've had some talks with district staff about where it might make sense. And really, we're highlighting this Red Rock area makes some sense to do some more additional monitoring and do some more localized groundwater assessment to try to figure out long-term how that would affect the district, and then maybe parlay that into a more district-wide kind of piece of that. So we're having some of those discussions. And that would be, can you establish thresholds or target hydrographs for those lakes that would support the lake system? Now, I can tell you from a hydrology and a water quality modeling is we're not going to make a difference on the flushing of the lake in a way that's going to make a difference in how the lake responds. Okay, so from a water quality, like if our water's drawn down, it can change the flushing of the lake, which would somehow change the water quality. It's not going to be enough to make a huge difference in that.
I'm going to interject here for just a moment, because it might be. About 18 months ago, you approved moving forward with the. We looked at just mimicking well distribution that was there in the 70s. After thinking about it more and where we were going with this, we thought it makes more sense to target those SFLs depending on what we want. So why we haven't moved forward. This kind of gives us on where do we want to look at the groundwater quality?
We got a purpose here.
I saw that in one of the reports and I thought that made a lot of sense.
Great. Yeah. Again, I'm not doing any original work yet. This is all just bringing in everybody else's great work.
Part of the work.
Right? Bringing it all together. So one of the areas that we're talking about now is eutrophication, right? The nutrient enrichment of these lakes. How does it impact the lakes, and what can we do about it? So that's where I want to start with this discussion, because that starts to connect the watershed and the lake together. We all know that phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. You put in more phosphorus, you get more algae. You take it away, you get less algae. And we've been really effective with this. I mean, you look at some of the alum treatments that we've done, some of the watershed projects that we've done, we've made a big difference in lakes. But what we don't talk a lot about is nitrogen, and here's why. Is it's complicated. Nitrogen's a much harder cycle to manage when you think about it. There's a lot of different ways to measure it. But when we look at it, the first thing we wanted to do is, what do we know about nitrogen in the watershed? What data do we have, and how does that link to the lakes? And I'm going to talk about some of these different ones, and we don't have time to go through them all, but really ammonium is the most available form for algae uptake. So when you get ammonium generated like out of sediments through the breakdown of organic material, that can drive an algae bloom right away. So this can happen in wetlands. It happens in lake bottoms and other areas. But that usually goes through a cycle then where it starts to get nitrified. So it turns into nitrate and nitrite. That can still be used, but it's not as energetically efficient. And then eventually you would like in a wetland situation for that anoxia then to denitrify it, which turns into nitrogen gas and loses it from the system. Okay, so that's why it's a complicated system. Phosphorus is conservative. I can track it through a system with a mass balance. Very hard to do with nitrogen because I don't know how much I'm losing to the atmosphere.
You speak to the dissolved organic nitrogen before, just.
Yep. What about it?
Well, just, I saw that enters lakes via amount of fertilizers, and you kind of went from ammonia to the nitrogen fixation.
I did,
You went through
yeah.
that cycle and you.
Dissolved organic nitrogen. So wetlands can discharge a lot of dissolved organic nitrogen. Like they have a lot of organic acids that go with those. And those have been linked to species like microcystis blooms, which is a toxic cyanobacteria that goes in lakes.
But I
themselves.
just, as we think Lake Susan, that's why I just kind
Right,
of wanted to.
Right. And we'll keep talking about that. But these are some of the things we want to, like what I think what we're going to end up doing is giving you some recommended monitoring ideas. And one of those is going to be monitoring these different nitrogen species in your lake and coming out of the wetlands. Because we need to understand nitrogen sources. We don't really understand them well in this suburban environment. We know there's nitrogen fertilizer put on your lawns. People do a lot of that, but I don't know how much of that makes it into the stormwater system. Right? Does that get pretty well incorporated in the soils? We know wetlands can generate a lot of different forms of nitrogen, but I don't know what forms they're generating and how much is going with that. So we've been doing a lot of phosphorus around, or a lot of monitoring around phosphorus, and we understand that pretty well. Nitrogen's harder. And so we haven't been, and so I'll show you, we really only have like TKN is the one, this total Keldol nitrogen. It's a way to measure ammonium and organic nitrogen, but I don't know what the split is between those two, right? And then I don't know how much nitrogen is, or nitrate is in the system, and nitrate can fuel algae blooms too. So there's more questions than we have answers around nitrogen, but I think it was good for us just to take an opportunity to kind of look at nitrogen and ask some questions around what are the potential impacts, and is it worth our investment to think harder about this, and what investment should we make to get us a better understanding of what's going on with
So the
nitrogen.
information out there, is the TKN the most commonly available?
It is.
Okay,
That's the
it's
one
for
you find. Yep.
water plants.
And if you look at
Okay.
P8 model, right, the P8 model that we use most consistently, it models TKN. And that's because it can be tied to particulates. TKN or P8 does build up and wash off of your watersheds of particles, and TKN can be tied to those particles. So we can say if we have 10 pounds of this, we know this percentage of it would be TKN based on the NERC studies. So that's what we have most about, but it's also one of the least helpful measurements that we have.
Vegetation that takes up the nitrogen and uses it?
A lot of vegetation can. So in the growing season in the summer in your forest, it'll take up a lot of nitrogen. Wetlands will take up a lot of nitrogen. They're very good at denitrifying. So one of the reasons you probably see higher nitrate concentrations in your watershed is the loss of wetlands. We all know that we lost a lot of wetlands, and those gassed off a lot of that nitrogen as a natural part of the cycle. So that's our question: is what do we want to do? Do we want to try to find opportunities to improve denitrification? Do we even know how much is occurring? How do we start to couple that, and how will that affect the lakes? Okay. So we looked at nitrogen. These are box plots, right? Where I look at the distribution of the data. The lines are the average. Top and bottom of the box is 25th and 75th percentiles. And then the whiskers are kind of that 95th and 5th. So I'm just looking at the spread of data in a given year. And you can see that for nitrite concentrations, this is Lake Lucy, Lake Ann, and Lake Susan. We don't have a lot of great data for nitrate. A lot of times you see all these lines that go across. I think, and Kate can help me verify this. Kate's done a lot of this work. So by the way, I should have introduced her. Kate Lucas is working with me on the project. So. Sorry about that. I just dove right into it. But a lot of this means you're at the reporting limit, right? So you don't know whether it could be below that, but you don't know what those values are because of the reporting limit. So one of the things we have to do is just understand what are the reporting limits, how do we measure some of these things. But I can tell you that I looked up the North Central Hardwood Forest reference lakes that they use during the standards development. And for nitrate, it should be less than 10 micrograms per liter. And you can see when we did have data that went below that reporting limit, we were operating as high as maybe 75 micrograms per liter. So we have nitrogen-enriched systems. I mean, there's no question that there's a lot of nitrogen in these systems. And I'll show it to you in TKN. TKN's hard, though, because cyanobacteria can fix nitrogen, and then they add nitrogen to your lake. And so also I see really high TKN numbers, but I don't know how much of that's just cyanobacteria fixing the nitrogen into your lake. Okay.
The atmosphere is 80% nitrogen. Plants are taking it
Lots.
down.
That's why they got really good at it. And I'm going to show you that they've taken over your lakes because of it, too. Okay, so thinking about these lakes now, like this is just kind of the background. We're thinking about nutrients. We're thinking about algae production. You know, we did the typical, what's the size of the lakes, average depth. These are both considered deep lakes, Lake Lucy and Lake Ann. Is that right? Yeah. Both. What's that?
Lucy's shallow.
Lucy would be a shallow lake. It's right on the edge of the PCA definition because the max depth is 20 feet, but the average depth is 6.5. Okay, so these are those types of systems. We know the watershed areas. We know the direct and the connected watershed areas. So we use that in our modeling. There's not a lot to go through there. I will tell you that the way that we see how these lakes are functioning is Lucy and Ann function very much together as one lake system and connected. Susan's its own independent system down below. Okay, and they operate very differently and they have very different impacts. Susan is very impacted. Lucy and Ann are not very impacted. Okay.
Kind of what the uplands are all about.
Right, exactly. So we're going to dive into that as we go along here, kind of that piece. So we know those things, and we know we have some invasive species. We have curly pondweed, Eurasia milfoil. We have carp. We have all those things that you guys have done a really good job of managing. I mean, when we look at the plant data, these are things that have been a focus of the district and things that you've been very successful at, as successful as you can be with some of these types of species, right? So those are all great stories. So if we look at Lucy to start, I'm showing you phosphorus up here in box plots. It's variable. Look at how it just kind of cycles, and every year is very different that goes in there. I'm going to argue that has a lot to do with the internal loading, sediment phosphorus release that's in there. Because the lake's unstable and it's mixing and setting up and stratifying, right? And then mixing again and stratifying. So in a year that's very quiescent, like not a lot of wind mixing events or something, phosphorus might be lower or higher because of internal loading, whereas a really heavy storm year, it's going to mix on and off. So that when you see all that bouncing around, that the first thing I think about is an unstable stratified lake. And I'm going to show you Ann, and it's a very different story. But here we have the TKN measurements. Again, North Central Hardwood Forest reference lakes are, between 600 and 1200 micrograms per liter TKN. You're operating in a lot of years on the upper end of that range, and in some years you've close to doubled that range in there. There's a lot of nitrogen in the system, is what I'm telling you, right? So nitrogen's probably impacting the system. Is it coming from the atmosphere and not any? Like, we're not going to manage atmospheric nitrogen. Or how do we start to go about doing that? And what you see is Lucy has a lot of algal production, and probably more algal production than you would expect under these phosphorus conditions. Okay, we're learning there's reasons for that. One of those is nitrogen fixation, that's cyanobacteria. As long as they have enough phosphorus, they can fix nitrogen and they can keep growing. And so then it doesn't matter as much what that concentration is, at least in the surface. Okay, now if we look at Lake Ann, it's a very different story. Now you have a highly stratified lake, right, where you have surface water that's warm and cold water that's trapped on the bottom. And look at surface concentrations of total phosphorus. I mean, they're well below the standard. You would think, this lake is great, we're doing awesome, right, and that kind of stuff. But look at the algae blooms. And a lot of these years, you're doing great. You do get some severe blooms. That's these little dots that are over there. But in the last 3 years, there's been some pretty severe algae blooms occurring on Lake Ann, based on the data. So there's some concern there about what's going on with Lake Ann. Again, not as much nitrogen in this system, but still high at over 1,000. So it's definitely a nitrogen enriched system. Where that nitrogen's coming from, I don't know yet. Okay. So why do we care about this? This is a little bit older data, but this is, again, part of our monitoring recommendations, is we're looking at the cyanobacteria concentrations. And I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but what I'm going to show you are the species that are known to produce toxins. So these are the ones that if you have a really severe bloom, could cause human health effects or could cause dog deaths, some of those types of things to be worried about. 100,000 cells per milliliter is our threshold in the World Health Organization where you have a moderate probability of some human health effects. Okay, so we just said what species are occurring in Lake Lucy and Lake Ann? Are they toxin producers? Yes. Not only do they produce microcystin, which is the most common, that's the one that gives you like dermatitis or an upset stomach, but they also create hepatotoxins like Slyns or spermopsin, anatoxin A, which is a neurotoxin, and saxitoxins are neurotoxins. These ones give you a little more severe problems, right? And so those are the ones we're more concerned about when we look at those species. Now, the good news for Lake Lucy is we haven't really hit that 100,000 cell threshold, at least back to 2011. There's a big date. There's 15 years of gap there, right? So we need to do some more monitoring there. But Lake Ann, that lake that I told you has great water quality, did exceed it in September of 2009, got over 100,000 cells of toxin-producing cyanobacteria. So what this says to me, I don't want to fear monger, right? That's the problem with this. What this says to me is the lake has potential, even though surface water phosphorus is low, it has the potential to create toxic cyanobacteria blooms that could be a human health risk and something we should pay attention to. Okay.
Was that a real wet year or do you think?
I'm going to explain it to you. I don't give away my I need my gotcha moment. No.
Trying to keep up with you.
In fact, my next slide is going to tell exactly why that is. So if we look at, this is Lake Ann over here, and we have our phosphorus concentrations are really low below the standard. Look at the bottom water phosphorus concentrations. They are 500 to over, at times, a milligram per liter in total phosphorus. So you're talking about, what's that, 10 times the concentration of your surface water is sitting in that bottom water. And what cyanobacteria have figured out how to do is there are a lot of them that I showed you are buoyancy regulators. So they know how to float up to the top and get light and then sink purposely down into that nutrient-rich water, get their phosphorus, and then they cycle back up, right? So what we're seeing are algae blooms that are more severe than we would expect with our phosphorus concentrations because there's a pool of phosphorus available for those cyanobacteria to drive those. That's my gotcha moment. So we see this a lot. We're doing a project right now on Cedar Lake in the Minneapolis chain of lakes where it was the same problem. They've been meeting standards for a long time, and then they had a whole lake planktothrix bloom, and they've been having some severe blooms on the shoreline. And that's a lake with 3 beaches. They do summer swimming events all the time. They do triathlons, all kinds of things on it. So they're very concerned about that part of it.
And Lake Ann is a high use swimming lake.
Is it-
I mean, that's the big.
has a beach
swim
on it, yep.
Oh, it's a huge beach for the
Right.
city of Chanhassen.
Right.
So yeah, that's a high.
So I think it's something to pay, it's something to pay attention to. And I think we need some more recent cyanobacteria monitoring to really understand what's going on in terms of that. And Lake Lucy, you can see here that it's more variable in the bottom water, but it does get over a milligram per liter in terms of concentration. In fact, there's been a couple measurements there over 2 to 3 milligrams per liter. To give you a sense, wastewater is 3 to 5 milligrams per liter, typically raw wastewater coming into a plant. So we're reaching some really high concentrations. Now, I will tell you, sometimes these bottom phosphorus, where you see them that high, if you tag the bottom when you're sampling and then pull your sampler back up, you can plume up a bunch of phosphorus. So you always got to kind of look at these numbers a little bit with a critical eye of maybe something happened in the field that they weren't quite aware of. But either way, there's a lot of water in the bottom of Lucy. It's unstable and mixes easily, so all that phosphorus can get up into the water column very easily, which is why you might have a year like 2022 where it's releasing, but it's just mixing up into the water column more. So we don't see the concentration at the bottom as much. Okay.
Does Lucy flow through Ann and then leave, or?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Lucy and so they're very much connected together, and then it goes down to Susan. And then those are the easy lakes, and then we could get into the problem child lake, which is Lake Susan, which has very high phosphorus concentrations all around, very high nitrogen concentrations. Probably, again, these nitrogen concentrations are probably a function of all that cyanobacteria I'm showing you, and they're fixing nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So it's not necessarily coming in from an outside source. It could be coming from the atmosphere, and we can't do anything about that. But we see a lot of severe algae blooms on this one. Again, bottom water concentrations, not as high as some of the other lakes, but still over 500 in most years at that peak micrograms per liter, and at times approaching a milligram per liter. So again, very high bottom phosphorus water that could be driving these blooms. Lake Susan also, this one definitely exceeds the World Health Organization 100,000 cells per milliliter threshold. And it's shown some late season blooms. This one here is Planktothrix, the yellow. Planktothrix is particularly nasty because it's the one that can do antitoxin A. Again, I don't know when it's going to produce toxins. We as a scientific community don't understand that. We just know it has the ability to do that. So sometimes we'll see a bloom and there's no toxins in it. And sometimes we'll not see the bloom and measure it and we'll find toxins in it. So it becomes very hard to predict and understand when it's going to be toxic or not. Okay, so when we started to say, okay, we're going to think about a restoration plan and connect this to the watershed, what's the first thing we're going to do? The first goal is to meet the summer average state water quality standards for the lake, right? But for Lake Ann, that's not enough, right? It's meeting the standards now, but you still have this potential for these cyanobacteria blooms. So we added a goal and we said minimize cyanobacteria blooms below the World Health Organization threshold throughout the growing season. We'd like to stay under that 100,000 cells. We're not going to make them go away. But we can reduce the magnitude of those. Okay, so to chart to understand that in that system, we developed a model. Some colleagues of mine at BAR, who are smarter than me, put together and built a BAR lake response model, we're calling it, for lack of a better name. I wish we had a fancier name for it, but it takes in the water balance, the temperature, and dissolved oxygen. The nice thing is it can model nitrogen and phosphorus, so we can start to ask the question about what are the dynamics of these two nutrients in the lake. It can look at phosphorus release from both the inorganic and the organic fractions too. We talk a lot about the inorganic anoxic release, but it can also look at the other parts of that. And it can look at phytoplankton, at least from the chlorophytes, which are your green algae. Those are your good algae, base of the food chain, and your cyanobacteria, which are the ones that are inedible. And so we can start to ask questions like, what role does nitrogen play in driving cyanobacteria blooms? What reductions are required to meet state water quality standards? Do we need to do both nitrogen and phosphorus reductions? Is that beneficial? Or can we just stick with our plan of phosphorus is king and go that route? And where should nutrient reductions be pursued? Maybe nitrogen is a factor in these lakes, but we're not going to reduce atmospheric nitrogen and fixation. But is there some benefit to looking at some of the other watershed sources and reducing the overall nitrogen enriched environment that we see in these lakes? And then doing some better monitoring around that. So this is the way that we set this up. We did a model for a wet year and a dry year. 2019 was our wet year and 2023 was our dry year. And this is the three lakes kind of connected. The first thing I'll point out to you is if you look at groundwater, which is in purple, it has almost no impact on these lakes whatsoever. When you look at the overall phosphorus balance, we did model that through, and it's just such a small water load to these lakes. It's not an important factor. So that was important. We could kind of say, okay, groundwater is important for lake level management, but from a nutrient standpoint, we don't really have to worry about it too much. And then if we look at internal loading, that's that high phosphorus in the bottom. That's in orange here. We modeled that through the system. And then the watershed loading, which is the dark blue, what happens there. And then in some of these cases, you have like you have a strong influence of that, upstream lake. And that's the light blue that's in there. So when we did the scenarios for how to get to good water quality or meet our water quality goals, we did look at what the influence was if Lucy met the water quality standard, because that just in and of itself will reduce phosphorus discharge downstream. And so what you see is that if we, using those budgets, we developed scenarios. And so the first scenario that we did was we said, okay, what happens if we just turn off that internal loading? We have to do something about it. It's too high, right? And so that's the first scenario that we did. And for Lake Lucy, that got us to the water quality standard. But we also wanted to ask the question was, will it also reduce algae blooms throughout the season? So these are, I'm not going to show you these for all the lakes, but this is our modeled plot. And so the orange here is our predicted chlorophyll concentration under current conditions. You see it gets up to 90 in the really heat of the season when there's a lot of out there. When we did the scenario, we were able to drop it down to 30. And so we ran our scenarios so that in the dry years, we didn't have any chlorophyll go over that standard that was in the lake. And using that mouse is kind of funny. And we tried our best to get chlorophyll down below that standard too in the wet years. We didn't always get it there because you'd have to push it so low, it would be an impossible task. So we were trying to balance what that task would be. So that's how we kind of set our goals for this. Okay, and so if we look at these, this is the way we ran our scenarios, was we said, okay, for Lake Ann, we know upstream lake's going to reduce from 48 to 31 if we restore Lake Lucy. We'll get internal loading down from 50 to 10 using alum, which we've been very effective with. And then do we need any more watershed reductions in that case? And the answer was no. We didn't need to do anything else. So the watershed's in pretty good shape from a nutrient delivery standpoint, okay? Lake Susan was a different story in that even with the reductions in internal loading, it wasn't going to get us all the way to our goal. There was also a required reduction of 24 pounds or something like 24 pounds that needed to be reduced. So again, it's not horrible in terms of like this huge reduction that's needed to meet these standards. Your watersheds, you guys have been putting a lot of work into them. I mean, you have the spent lime system that's in there. You have iron hand sand filters. You've been building ponds. You've been doing a lot, right? And that's showing, I think, in the modeling. It's a matter of how can we take the next step that's in there. We're not going to talk about it today. We did look at a lot of that work. Really, the plants are about biodiversity, in my opinion, and not abundance. I mean, we're not going to be able to reduce the abundance of plants in the lake. So he was looking at, can we bring in plants from the outside and increase biodiversity? And so we'll talk about that another time, but it is a piece that we're looking at. Lake Ann has great, and Lucy both have really good species richness, and Susan's hurting. But you'll never get there until you get the water clarity first. And I think that's what Ray showed in Lake Riley, right? Was got to get the clarity first, then we can have some success at getting some plants to establish. Okay, so let's talk about the role of nitrogen. This is a wordy slide with a lot of nerdy kind of stuff on it. I don't need to go into all that. But really what we saw was what happens is the green line here is your modeled green algae. Those are the ones that don't have buoyancy regulation, that are dependent upon staying in the water column and nutrients. And the blue line is your cyanobacteria, modeled cyanobacteria. So what you see is about halfway through the summer, the cyanobacteria take off and the chlorophytes just stay level. What's happening there? Well, your nitrogen has crashed in the system. So they've used up all the nitrogen available in your lake, and now the ones that can fix nitrogen from the environment or from the air are taking over. And so they're like, there's plenty of phosphorus here. Let's go. We can get all the nitrogen we need out of the atmosphere. And they're taking off. All of these lakes exhibit this. So what you find is that your phytoplankton community towards the end of the season is really dominated by cyanobacteria because there's still plenty of phosphorus and they can get nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So what that tells me is Phosphorus is still king. It's still the best tool we have at reducing it, but these systems are co-limited, meaning if I put more nitrogen in, you're still going to grow more algae throughout the season. So nitrogen reductions opportunistically make sense for these lakes. It'll help in the overall grand scheme of things, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time or extra money pursuing all these types of projects. So I don't think you should be doing underground wood chip bioreactors or anything like that. But if we can find wetland restorations that can improve nitrogen removal, I'm on board.
And success with wood chips. What, nitrogen? Phosphorus?
Just phosphorus. That's where we get the most success. There aren't any successes where you reduce just nitrogen and you see, I mean, Kate can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's not a lot of literature out there. This is where Schindler, I've seen him literally pound the pulpit that nitrogen doesn't matter, is what he said. We know it's more nuanced than that, right? But what he's saying is when we've done all these paired watersheds or paired lake studies, phosphorus is where you got the reduction in that phytoplankton.
The tourist Austin area. They were putting the chips into the wetlands.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what it is. So what's the water quality drivers? Phosphorus management is still our best approach that's in there. Internal phosphorus loading is a major driver. I know I get accused a lot of being the alum guy and just want to put alum in every lake. When phosphorus concentrations are a milligram per liter in the bottom, I mean, they are. And I want to say too, that Craig Wilson, who also is a colleague of mine, did the previous study. He also identified alum treatment for all three of these lakes. So it's not just me, right? This has always been around. Right. So, and then watershed reductions can be protective long-term. I'm not saying don't do those, but really Susan's where you need to do those watershed projects. That's where I would focus those watershed projects now. Improved nitrogen monitoring is required. We just need to better understand it. So we'll give some recommendations on reporting limits and what types to monitor, and we'll work with staff to figure out what makes sense in your monitoring program. We don't want to create something impossible to handle. There are other places we can add value. Okay. And then watershed project types, I realized I forgot to do this. I was going to put some nice pictures in there. I forgot it. Sorry. I'll do that. But structural, the way that we looked at, there's 4 ways to reduce phosphorus or nutrients in general from your watershed. There's structural engineer projects. This is where Scott comes in and we have an engineer and he says, I can build a filter here. I can build a pond. I can build an underground system and we can strip phosphorus out. These are great because we know we can engineer, we can design that removal, right? When I have a natural system, it's much harder to predict what that removal is going to be. So we want to maintain those. But pond maintenance is a new topic that's coming out too, is you guys started it. It all started here with your pond monitoring program in 2013. And people realized these ponds have 1 milligram per liter of phosphorus at any given time during the summer. And so we all started thinking a lot harder about how these ponds are functioning. We realized ponds also do internal loading, right? And need maintenance. And when I say maintenance, it might just be doing something about that internal loading in those ponds so that they function the way they were designed. Okay. So we wanted to identify which ponds might be in need of maintenance and how that goes. And then we want to identify wetland restoration. We're trying to use the work that Zach's been doing in MinRam and identify which wetlands make sense from a wetland condition standpoint, but also we can stack the water quality benefits or flood benefits, or maybe the flood benefits prevent us from doing something meaningful in that wetland. And we can identify it that way. And then non-structural, think about street sweeping, education and outreach, which we haven't really thought about. And then individual practices, again, what continuing the programs of what you do on your lawn matters kind of thing. Okay.
So this is
Yeah.
sort of applied research. I mean, we're doing our own research. We're trying different things using the best knowledge that we have, and we're doing experiments essentially on our own, aren't we? This process. I mean, other people are doing the same thing, or is this being done by universities, or is it?
I think there's a mixture of us doing it. You guys are a big part of that, and working with BAR and doing applied research, trying things and seeing what happens and identifying that stuff. We also connect with St. Anthony Falls Laboratory at the U, and we've been on a project team with them to understand these practices. The city of Egan is another client I work with a lot. They're ahead of everybody. They've done a lot of alum treatments. There's a lot of people out there trying different things, so much so that the Stormwater Research Council just had a pond symposium. We spent 2 days talking about nothing with ponds.
How we share.
Right, exactly. So we are all working together, and data that we're using here comes from Egan, comes from other places to help give context to what you're
But
doing.
it's sort of applied experiments, local experiments that we're all doing.
Yep,
This isn't being done in a lab somewhere necessarily. I
right.
mean, the analysis might be, but what we're doing in the field is our applied projects to determine what works.
Yep, you got it.
Been doing, promoting the street sweeping for years.
Yep.
Bloomington's been doing it.
And I think that's really, we're at that point, like we've done all the tried and true methods. We kind of know what's out there. And then what was a tried and true method, stormwater ponds, is becoming problems later because we didn't really understand what the long-term impacts of those would be. And
Is
so
it
now we're
pond
trying to adapt to that.
Maintenance, is that essentially dredging out some of that?
I
don't know what you mean by pond maintenance.
When I say pond maintenance, it's looking at the pond itself and trying to figure out two questions. One is it capturing enough phosphorus from the watershed? That's your pond cleanout question. Is it sized appropriately? And then your second question is it holding on to the phosphorus that it is capturing? So particulate phosphorus comes into the bottom of that pond. Is it just re-releasing and undoing that? And when we get to the Lake Riley story, which we're not going to get to tonight, that's what's happening in Lake Riley, whereas we did a good job of turning off the internal loading, and that phosphorus concentration is really down. And then we had a really wet spring, and all those ponds and Bear Path flushed a big pulse of phosphorus down. And we had 2 toxic blooms at the beach. The city of Green Prairie called and was like, help us figure out what's going on. I'm pretty convinced that that's what happened there. So we just have more work to do now back in the watershed. We always said we'd never get there just with internal loading. We always had to keep at the watershed, but that was a great opportunity. So we've reduced the frequency significantly of those cyanobacteria blooms, but we haven't eliminated them in that case.
So-
Also pond, how, it's like, it's not just dredging, it's also like, cause I know, I was involved in a big study on, what about the tree growth and should it be, how much do you want to prevent mixing and, how the different environmental factors affect a pond to see if there's a method that would work to help reduce some of the discharge of that phosphorus.
Yep.
That's why I was
There's a
curious what
lot
he
of
meant
work
by
going on.
pond maintenance, because.
Yeah, so it could be, we're gonna cut down some trees and let the grass grow, or it could be
So, right.
something else, so.
So, yeah, we just did a study with SAFL. We just finished it. It just got published that looked at, we modeled, I say we, SAFL did the work, but modeled a bunch of different pond maintenance activities. And some of it was like, do we put an aerator in it?
Yeah.
Now, when you have 1,200 ponds, you can't aerate 1,200 ponds throughout the city of Eden Prairie.
No, but key ones in the chain.
Key ones you could, right? So with aeration, they looked at iron filings applications. They looked at alum treatments to sequester phosphorus. They looked at clean out and stuff. And they found the most effective tool was alum. It was just the one that was lasting the longest, doing the best at sequestering that phosphorus that goes in there. The second part of that was street sweeping around the ponds. The USGS just did a study recently that showed if you street sweep in the areas to the pond, it will extend the life of that pond and the effectiveness of that pond.
It's not really maintenance is maybe just a misleading term. I think.
Okay.
For the answers
Sure.
you're giving, I don't connect with maintenance. Yeah,
Because the pond is all,
yeah.
but yeah, it's not just dredging.
So
Yeah,
we're-
yeah.
So we're really dealing with really complex systems
Mhm.
with many, many variables.
The ponds blew my mind when we did the pond study for you, 2000, I don't remember when it was. But we were finding ponds that were only 3 feet deep and they were anoxic all season. It just didn't matter. Every time we put a DO meter in there was no DO in that pond. And the old paradigm was if it's really shallow, it should be mixing all the time, right? There should be plenty of atmospheric diffusion into that pond. But I think the oxygen demand in these ponds, because they're so organic and they're getting so much organic material, it's just through the roof. So it's just taking out that oxygen so fast that we're seeing anoxia in all of these ponds. So
All have hit on something though, in the steering committee, both pond maintenance and sweeping, helping cities out with it, were brought up as something that
Haven't we done that a little bit? Didn't we do Chanhassen, like help us?
we helped purchase, we helped with the fire street sweep. We can using their GIS to track it with lane miles that are done.
We're just trying to keep that organic matter out of the pond.
Engineer Sobiak and I have talked about, putting together a map of target areas, fire sweet.
Hmm.
But it's just, I think it is an opportunity. Street sweeping is dollar per pound most effective.
We've known that for about 20 years.
So it's just now if we, now, Fire Lake did their study, and the Dinah did their study. It depends on the timing of the year, what you do it at, but. So I think it is an opportunity for the district to help out the cities. To do that, especially pond maintenance and so. 600 pounds.
But then, you know, as you increase street sweeping, then you gotta start worrying about what's in the street sweepings and where are you gonna dispose of it? So it's kind of like, it's not a cure-all necessarily.
Sucking it up, right?
But yeah, I mean, it's still better than
Burns
landfill
filter.
than they go in water bodies, so it's, yeah.
We used to make burns.
So-
with it.
Yeah, just to try to keep us moving on that kind of stuff. So we have those identified going in there. We have the structural practices identified. You can see like, you know, iron and handstand filters. Oops. Iron and handstand filter is this blue dot here, this blue dot here. There's some over there. So those we've carried forward from previous studies. Like we didn't come up with new engineered projects. These are ones that haven't made it into your CIP. Just you only have so much money to go around to build stuff. They just haven't been scored high enough in the priority. We're keeping those moving forward. And so they look like this where, you know, was it in the current CIP? No, or yes. Was it built and constructed? What year was it constructed? We're compiling all that information to try to pull that together. So we have those structural practices pretty well identified. And then we were talking about internal loading in ponds, you know, really building off of that field assessment of the Mitchell and Riley subwatershed study that we conducted in 2021. Couldn't remember when that was. Trying to build off of that of those 9 ponds where we have high anoxia and going through there. And there's lots of ideas floating around about what we can do in these ponds. We talked about sand capping them. We were having that conversation today. Kate and I were like, could you sand cap it so you reduce that sediment oxygen demand? And would that be effective? There's lots of things that are, I think people are crazy ideas that people are coming up with that maybe would be effective. But Kate went through and she used those average anoxic numbers and average release rates from that study and applied that to any pond that was greater than 1 acre in size and greater than 3 feet or deeper, right? Because we would assume there's more anoxia in those ponds. And what's nice is this kind of screens out the ponds. This pond here had a potential for releasing 68 pounds in a season of phosphorus out of those sediments. So we're prioritizing these ponds and saying, okay, let's go through and figure out which ponds of these would maybe have the biggest impact, biggest bang for the buck, and we'll promote those as ponds that could do some studies on and figure out whether alum treatment or something else could be really effective. Just so you know, this worked really well in Egan. We did 2 ponds that were 2.5 acres in size, and we're 7 years out now, 7 years out now, we still have 0 release from the sediments that are in there. So the alums worked really well in that kind of situation. And there's lots of reasons why. And then the alum treatments, we have to carry those through because I think those are really important when we think about cyanobacteria. And I think all 3 lakes would be good candidates for doing something about that internal loading. And so now we're getting into the harder part, which is, okay, let's think about wetland restoration. So we're starting to think about these wetland complexes. So many of these are identified in our system, just the way the model is done, as a pond. Right? But we know that they're not ponds. We know that they're wetland systems. And these wetland systems are really complex in terms of biogeochemistry. We're figuring out that they take particulate phosphorus and settle it out, transform it into dissolved phosphorus, which grows algae even faster, and it causes us more problems than it helps with phosphorus. But we know we lose nitrogen. So we're trying to figure out how do we balance these things like nitrogen and phosphorus control in these wetlands that we have, which ones are high priority, which ones are flood control, and thinking about biodiversity, if we can get it, is kind of how it comes into that system. And so I'm just going to bring in the example where this is happening in this wetland in the southwest part draining Lake Susan. You've been looking at this wetland for a long time. It feeds into the spent lime filter after this arrow, and the spent lime is what's stripping out a lot of that phosphorus. What we found out, though, is there's so much phosphorus coming out of the wetland that it was overwhelming the filter, right? We couldn't keep up with the phosphorus that's coming out there. So we asked the question, let's go out and try to figure out what do we know about the wetland? What can we do about it? And so we use some tools that are out there being developed by the Army Corps of Engineers in the Lake Erie Basin for Lake Erie has huge cyanobacteria blooms in the western part that affect drinking water. So we're trying to use the same science here, right? Let's build off of what they do. And so we did these different extraction techniques, and we looked at sorption indices to ask questions about what parts of the wetland are releasing phosphorus, which ones might be absorbing it. And we found that the cattail areas are much better at holding phosphorus than the open water areas, right? And so now we're talking about maybe we'll go try doing some treatments in the open water areas to see if we can lower the phosphorus enough to make the filter be effective. Okay.
Put in a bunch of cattails.
We're not there yet. I think it's a concept. It's a great concept. I just would say we're not there yet in terms of that piece. But that when you build a wastewater treatment wetland, that's the first thing you do is use cattails because they're so effective. They put on a lot of biomass, can take up a lot of phosphorus. Okay, and then we looked at non-structural projects. So this is just looking at the Lake Susan watershed. And what's interesting about this watershed is there's not a lot of road impervious surface compared to the parking lot. There's actually more parking lot impervious surface in this watershed than there is road impervious surface. So when we start to think about street sweeping, does sweeping a parking lot make sense? Well, when you think about street sweeping, you want that canopy cover, a lot of leaves. Those are the streets where you can be most effective. But it would be worth looking at these parking lots and asking the question, should we street parking lots? And should that be part of our maintenance agreements when somebody comes in with the development? So this is something we're exploring or we're pushing forward in these plans of an area to explore to figure out that benefit. And this is going to come back when we talk about chloride, as you can imagine. Okay, and then same process for Mitchell and Red Rock. It's going to be the same story. You know, Mitchell actually has much better phosphorus concentration than it did back in the 70s and 80s. And it's really it's hovering right around that standard. It's a fairly high bottom phosphorus. Again, back in the 90s, it got up over 1 milligram per liter. It's been much better around 500 in more recent years. Now, it's hard to say whether that's just the mixing cycles that are going on. There's a lot of things that can affect that. 500 is still too high. I can tell you 200 is my rule of thumb. Usually I want to see it under 200 to know that it's not having great impact on that. And we're seeing lots of algae blooms. So again, even though our phosphorus concentrations are hovering at the standard, we're seeing a lot of algae. It indicates that internal loading could be driving a big part of that. Nitrogen's the same story where in Mitchell, we have a lot of nitrogen, total Keldol nitrogen, and nitrate data is really spotty just because of the reporting limit issue. Red Rock's much worse water quality in terms of higher phosphorus concentrations. In some summers, it's over, the average is almost 100. That's quite high. And the internal loading is much spottier here, right? So when we go do those bottom samples, this is the shallowest lake that we have, and we do those bottom samples. Sometimes it's high and sometimes it's not. Again, that could be mixing. This lake is also highly influenced by a boom bust fishery, right? So you go through periods, you have a lot of bullheads in there. That's when you see this highest internal loading. They're stirring up that sediment and getting it all mixed up. And when you go through a fish kill and better fisheries conditions, the phosphorus just go down, right? So there's a fishery component in these shallow lakes that we're looking at too, to try to understand how that management might work. So Red Rock's the one I'm on the fence, like alum treatment. We got to look at the fishery component of that first before we would go there. But it has lots of algae blooms and poor water clarity. I'm just watching time to be able to get through some of these things. So same story. We did our model scenarios. For Mitchell, there was some required watershed reductions in those wet year conditions. About 30 pounds of watershed is needed. So we got to find projects in the watershed to help us get to that, to support whatever work we do in lake. Red Rock, the watershed was in better shape in those conditions, and internal loading was a big piece of that. But what we're mulling around is if fish is the reason for Red Rock Lake, this might be a fisheries management lake and not nearly as much alum, watershed, those other types of pieces that are in there. So it's a much more complicated lake than any of the other ones that we're working with. So we put together our project list. So we have projects from the other old reports, and those still are good idea projects. We did it for Red Rock, and we looked at the phosphorus loading in these different projects that are in there, so we can bring those forward. And then we did our ponds assessment too, where we said, oh, any pond over 1 acre can have a lot of release, and we have those identified. But what's interesting is a lot of these turn out to be emergent wetlands in our classification. It's not really a traditional pond. So a lot of times a pond looks like these, where we have these big cattail rings, we have an open water area in the middle. What do we do about a pond like this? So this is where Lake Susan's really critical in your kind of quiver of understanding, can we make a difference in the Lake Susan wetland? Because that'll translate to a lot of these other ponds that might be potential loaders. Okay, so I wish it was an easier story, but these plumbed wetland, pond, whatever you want to call them, are really difficult from a management standpoint. A stormwater pond's easy. It's constructed. I know exactly what I can do. Wetlands get a lot more difficult because there's other functions we have to think about in those wetlands too.
So if we come up with a location and we have 2 or 3 items that we think we want to look at, so how do we balance those in deciding? Because it seems like you described some elements that were very effective in some areas and not in others. And then there's 3 other things we could be doing also. So how do we evaluate when we have a combination of potential things to look at? How do we do that?
We'll start with tried and true. I always want tried and true. I want you to spend the money on projects we know are going to make a difference. This is why we do alum. This is why we do constructed pond alum. Like there are methods that we've been very successful at. And then as we get into more experimental, that's where we work with staff. So we'll be, as we list this project, our next step now is to sit down with staff and be like, okay, this is the types of systems that we want to work on, right? How do you want to advance the understanding of what to do in a system like this? Well, Lake Susan Wetland, you've already invested some time and money in. Let's figure it out there, and then maybe we can translate that in 5 years down the road. We have a better sense of what to do. That's how I envision it, at least. I don't know. Support staff vision, yeah. Right.
At least that wetland is, should help that we got the horses out of there.
Yeah. We'll take every bit we can. Oh yeah, I forgot about those horses.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually protected water.
Yeah.
Under our shoreline code.
Right.
Yeah, he had a horse farm there.
Yep.
Up until a couple of years before I retired.
I remember that because we inspected that pond. I remember going out and doing that one. Yeah. And then again, looking at wetland restoration, this wetland is such a key part of Lake Mitchell, but so difficult to know what to do with. So here's another one that's like the Lake Susan wetland. Maybe we start to go down the path of let's look at a feasibility study. It'd be great to work with our wetlands group, the biogeochemistry people, get Scott and the flood people, get everybody together and figure out what can we do to maximize overall benefits in a wetland like this. So we're going to call out wetlands that are really critical for these lakes. I wish I had an answer of do A, B, C, and D. I just don't have that yet. I don't think we as a scientific community do. If you ever want to look, there was a set of studies that was done in Minnehaha Creek and the Wasserman Channel where they did some of this kind of work. And they even brought in Cadlick, who's like the master. He wrote the book on treatment wetlands, and they still came up with, I don't know what to do.
Painter's Creek.
Yeah.
Thing too,
Yeah. So these are challenging. These are areas we need to learn more as scientists.
That's an area too, going back to our earlier conversation with Eric and thinking about. Area has a trail system around it. That trail system right now, I just like it probably is due for being up.
It's very rough. It's very rough trail.
Time to get in, we need to look at elevating that trail system. What do we need to do? And aligning those projects together. I think that's part of it to your other question, Tom, is looking at other opportunities. That does it make more sense because the city is already doing it. Get far enough ahead and start to plan those.
We should be factoring in the social benefit, because obviously people want to get out and be using it, so.
Right. And then there's a much denser network of roads in here. So again, in the southwest part of Red Rock, these are opportunities for infiltration, for street sweeping, some of those other areas, because they're a big loader to the lake. That was that high potential for infiltration out of the study. We can look at opportunities in there that might be able to help us. So again, we're trying to stack all the benefits here the best that we can.
So if we got benchmarks then that we can start measuring against as we try some of these things.
Benchmarks, what do you mean by benchmark?
Where the problems are. What
Yeah.
the stresses are, then
That's what we're doing.
some of that stuff so that we got something to measure
Yep.
against. If we try
Exactly.
receiving or whatever.
Yep. Trying to find some of those areas so that we can start to measure what those impacts are and start to figure out what some solutions that might work that we don't have tried and true methods for. Okay, so that's the lakes. I can blow by this. That they're co-limited by phosphorus and nitrogen. I think we talked about phosphorus is still the best way to go. The watershed phosphorus, you should feel good about that, in my opinion, that watershed phosphorus loading is really pretty moderate in these watersheds. None of them are so high that I think it's precluding our ability to restore the lakes. And that's really a testament to all the BMPs that we've been doing for decades and work in the watershed and street sweeping and everything that's being done now. And then I say all three, it's really all, well, I say 4 of the 5 demonstrated high internal loading, and Mitchell or Red Rock, I'm still on the fence on what we think we should do. Okay. So let's talk about chloride. And then I want to talk about, I know it's a lot. I do want to talk about the wake boat study. I'm assuming you guys want to hear about what we, right? That's a really hot topic. So, okay, so let's just talk about chloride. We know there's a lot of impact from chloride. You can get dense salt, high salt water sitting on the bottom of a pond or a lake. That can cause anoxia artificially, and that can drive phosphorus out of the sediments, and then that can diffuse out of this layer and into the lake in terms of that. So we just wanted to say, okay, let's look at chloride concentrations. You guys actually have a great data set. Usually it's really hard to get data. This is a testament to Josh, really, but it's hard to get data in March and April because the ice is rotten, right? You can't get out on the lake. It's hard to get out there. And somehow Josh got data. So,
Yeah, he's our safety officer.
so we talked about using Robbinsdale's hovercraft one time to try to get it. The only way to get out there. Anyways, there's good data here, but both Lucy and Ann have pretty low, relatively low chloride concentrations to the standard. But if you look at the net North Central Hardwood Forest background numbers, that's 4 to 10 micrograms per liter. We're still operating between 50 and 75 in Lake Lucy and 40 and 60 in Lake Ann. So there's still inflated chloride levels is what I would argue in these lakes, and that's an impact from all the road salt that's out there. Lake Susan did show some exceedances of that standard in March during those snow melt. This is the period where snow starting to melt. There's a lot of transport of all the salt, residual salt that's out there. It came in and the lake actually exceeded the standard. So that's a problem. So we put together, we looked at roads and we looked at parking lots. District staff put together the GIS, and then Kate put together the calculations to kind of figure this out. And what you see, we just used some literature values. We didn't have actual values from Eden Prairie or Chanhassen, so we just used literature values. And we know that street surfaces tend to get about 10,000 pounds per acre per year, and impervious surfaces, parking lots tend to get about almost 13,000. And we do those calculations, and you can see why those concentrations are so high in Lake Susan is you're getting almost 1 million pounds per year on average of salt loaded onto that watershed, right? And that's going to make its way into the lake itself. And then we can see what's interesting about Lake Susan is it's not really dense from a roadway standpoint, but it is quite dense from a parking lot standpoint. So if you want to focus an area to try to do some salt management, when you talk about your low salt, when you talk about your low salt practices on parking lots, this is a great area to focus on because you have a lake that's seeing some impacts from the chloride and an area that we know has a lot of delivery of chloride from parking lots. And we see it from a pond standpoint too. So Kate put together loading for each of these ponds and said which ponds are at risk of having high chloride, which might affect that phosphorus loading and those functions. And we came out with pond IDs. It's not, we didn't make it up. I mean, this is your Susan Park Pond chloride measurements in 2016. I mean, look at these concentrations. I mean, you have some at almost 700 milligrams per liter of chloride. And that's draining all that, those impervious parking lots in those areas that are in there. So we identified a bunch of ponds that might be impacted by chloride. And these are ponds that we can start to think about, again, developing a program. How do we manage salt on that parking lot and make sure that it's not impacting the pond, which then protects the lake, right? Thinking about that process.
Factoring in some of Connie's important ideas.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Those are those. Yep. There's lots of ways to do it. Roadways too. Like you'll find in Mitchell and Red Rock again. Red Rock did have a concentration some in that February, March period that does get closer to that standard. So it's Red Rock showing some more of that. Mitchell's not showing it, but it is elevated chloride. But again, here, when we look at that, this is a much denser road. So now we've flipped it. It's less about the parking lots in Red Rock, and it's more about the road maintenance that's going on through that one that you're going to make a difference. Now, I'm not saying all these purple areas are your parking lots. I mean, everything makes a difference, and the loading's higher in those, but that becomes more of that. And then this pond here, we all know this pond, right? It's right outside our door. And we know that this impervious area of this whole complex is really high. And I've been here in the winter. But it's another great spot that's right outside the door that we can maybe figure out linking that pond concentrations to parking lots or other things that you can do.
Sweep the parking.
Yep. And again, we identified ponds that are at risk from that. So chloride's pretty straightforward. I think, it's not something that we could link to the lake directly, but we are seeing impacts in the lakes. Both Red Rock and Susan are showing signs of having serious impacts. When you get over that standard, that's when you start having toxicity issues. Even at those lower concentrations, you can start to affect your plant diversity. You can affect zooplankton populations. We have some literature out there that we'll bring into the report that kind of talk about those impacts.
The chloride stays dissolved forever in these ponds, or does it ever re-solidify? I don't know if that's the right term, but
It won't precipitate back out. It stays dissolved, so it's going to go where the water.
just
What's
put
that?
it into slush
Stays
at the
for a
bottom.
really long time.
Yes,
I mean,
right.
there is no way, that's what I'm thinking. This is a very hard thing to try to tackle, because if you already got high levels, what are you gonna do with what's already in there?
A colleague of ours at BAR is working with somebody else in Michigan, and they have a treatment process that removes chloride. That's not reverse osmosis.
Distillation.
I don't understand. It's a chemistry process that they're experimenting with, and they've had some luck with it in the lab, but whether you can scale it or not is the real question. So I don't know that you could scale it to treat these ponds in a way that would make a difference, and I don't know if it'd be affordable. Well, it's working with Mark Kaiser in Michigan. He's in Kalamazoo. Yep. Okay, so next steps. We've got all these projects. We're lining them all up. We're getting there. We're going to sit down with staff. I think our next one is to do some workshops with staff and say, okay, this is what we're thinking. How does this look to you guys? And you guys know a lot of the background that I don't know, making sure we get all that in there. We can start to identify and prioritize projects to get us to where we need to be. And then we're furiously writing the plans, trying to get drafts of those done and some of those meetings so we can get those out the door. So contact Terry if you have any questions. Any questions on that while I switch slide decks here real quick?
So we've got about 10 minutes before our regular board meeting starts.
I can do this in less than 10.
Okay.
It's like name that tune. I can do that in. I just want to give you an update on where we're at with the wake boat study. So if you remember, we did 2024, we did application. We had originally done in 2018 applications in these deep areas. And just so in the southern part of the lake and the eastern part of the lake. The water quality got a little bit better, but we weren't like jumping for joy. We were a little concerned that we weren't having the impact that we wanted. And so the question was, why is that? Well, we cored more areas. So we cored through the middle part of this lake and these other zones, and we found higher release rate sediments in other parts of the lake. So one hypothesis was that we didn't treat enough of the lake, but another hypothesis that kept coming up was, are wake boats stirring up the sediments in a way that are making the alum treatment ineffective? Okay, so we wanted to figure out, okay, can we answer this question? This is just the design that we have. So, by 2024, we actually put down these numbers. We had 70 in zone 1 grams per meter squared of aluminum. We had 170 almost in zone 2, but we only put down 41 and 60 in those other zones. So that's this zone here and this zone here, where it was shallower area where we don't want to put too much down because we were a little worried about how effective it would be, but we wanted to put enough down to see if we could measure effectiveness. Okay.
So can you say why you didn't put it in the pinch point where everybody goes in the same little line where it's?
It was really shallow there, and we were worried about just resuspending the set amount in there, and it's a cost benefit too. Like we're trying to get there.
That would be really good to identify why it wasn't done, because that's the area that everybody's most concerned about.
Yeah.
In the lake.
This area right in here.
Right where the pin, that's where the public beach is right there. And
Right there,
it's
okay.
where everybody goes. You really almost can't stay away
Sure.
from the shore, and that's where all the traffic goes through.
Yeah.
So it's
Address it.
Great context. Yeah. And we need to have a little more of the context about boat activity and some of those things
yeah.
in the study.
That was a place I wanted you to.
Yeah.
study.
There is no alum there, so there was
Correct. I
nothing to
didn't know that.
study.
Yeah. So there's nothing but that would be good context of why it wasn't done, because
Sure.
to put that
It's
in
really cost
perspective.
effective. We're trying to use the least amount and be effective, right? I mean,
Basically, we didn't put it there because it would just get washed away.
we were worried about that, and it didn't show as a really high release rate area, and we can't treat every inch of the lake. If we do, it got too expensive. So that was the part that seemed the most reasonable to not treat and still be effective in changing overall water quality in the lake. But I hear you. I think that's we need to tell that story. We put those in there. So these are the two applications. Again, in 2018, we did just these two areas. And then in 2024 of October, we treated these other areas. But we wanted to know, like, since that time, since we did that treatment, SAFL came out with their study where they did wake boat runs over sediments, and they found at 14 feet, I mean, look at this sediment resuspension that's occurring over 14 feet. There's no question that, and even, this is 5 minutes after, you still see some of it suspended, but a lot of it's settling straight back down. And 10 and 15 minutes after, you still see some in the water column. So what threw us for a loop was we were operating off of previous studies that said 15 feet you'd be safe. We thought we'd have some parts of the lake that wouldn't be impacted by wake boats. Well, there aren't many parts of Lotus Lake that are greater than 20 feet deep. So that kind of threw the study a little bit. But now we know, okay, there's sediment resuspension happening. We believe that this would impact the alum treatment, but how so? We did coring. Remember, we cored each one of these zones and we looked for total aluminum because we wanted to ask the question, is it moving around? And then we also had a point in each one of those zones to say, what's the phosphorus speciation and what's the release rates that are in there? So we look at just the spring and fall. Spring is in green, fall is in orange. Great color choices, by the way. You see that in most of these, the fall has less aluminum in the sediments than the spring. That suggests that maybe the aluminum's moving around, and that could be a function of wake boat activity. The thing that's convoluted is if we go deep into the sediment profile all the way down to 20, it's lower all the way down. You would really expect if it's just mobilizing superficial sediments, you would expect it just to mobilize up in the top, but these two lines should align better.
Like the one at Station 30 does, or?
Right. You would think they would be closer together in terms of those. And we do have error bars on here. We can measure, like, statistically, these are the same, but statistically, these are probably different because the error bars don't intersect. It's just a great visual way to kind of bring that out. So we think that it's moving around, but it's a little bit convoluted in terms of that. We also learned that aluminum's not the best measurement. It's very difficult in the lab. We're not getting the recovery that we wanted. It's cheap. You can do it for $15 a sample, which is why we chose it. But we're having problems recovering it. So we put down 100 grams per meter squared. We're recovering 30. We can only calculate 30 in our water column from it. So
did you sample in the area where you didn't treat to see if it had been carried up?
We didn't. We just wanted to look at the differences in the treatment zones to see if it was going down.
Yeah.
Again, this is all cost.
To see if it was being washed along with the wake boats into that main area.
Yeah. And we can do that in the future. I think we thought we could do in the future. We were trying to, again, be as cost effective as we can with it. But I think it's a good point. So let's look at this just for time's sake. So you have time to go to the bathroom before your meeting starts. If we look at it, just looking at the top 6 centimeters, aluminum went down between spring and fall. This suggests it's probably moving around. I think it is getting suspended with those wake boats, but it's settling back down. Now, when it gets suspended, it doesn't release the phosphorus. It still holds on to it, and it's still not available for algal production. What you worry about is scouring and exposing new sediment that has higher fractions in it.
If there's any vegetation down there, it's blowing it around. I mean,
Yep. There's other impacts, but we're talking about just from the alum treatment. We did also, or I say we, Josh and the crew here, did aluminum measurement in the water column throughout the season. And for the most part, they were non-detect, even during those really heavy boat use periods. We did get one detection, but it was in the deeper part of the lake. So I'm not really sure what that's about. And then if we look at phosphorus, so again, this is surface phosphorus concentrations. After the first treatment, we were a little disappointed, right? I mean, it reduced, your average was up here, now you're down here, but it wasn't this dramatic change that we see when we do a lot of these other ones. But we know Lake Riley, it took 2 treatments. We did them in split treatments. We had to do the second one, and we got really good conversion. So we're like, let's stick with it. We'll do the second treatment. We'll expand the area and look at what happened to our phosphorus concentrations. 2025 was the best year. So it was effective. Like it did work for 1 year. Right? We went more than 1 year out of it, but it did work for that year. So that was a good sign. And when we look at bottom phosphorus concentrations, again, they were higher, getting up to 1 milligram per liter. After the first half dose, we only dropped them to close to 500. After the second half dose, they're well under that 200 benchmark that I talk about. So it's been effective, even with a heavy boat year, at reducing phosphorus in the bottom waters in that piece. And we're seeing that with the release rate study too. The yellow bars were the original release rate study that we designed off of. The blue bars are 2020 when we did more sites. And then the green bars are 2025 spring and the orange bars are 2025 fall. But if you look at it, at almost all the sites, we've suppressed sediment phosphorus release significantly in all those sites.
Even before the second one, it was remarkably better than
Yeah.
it had been. I mean,
Okay.
noticeably as a almost daily swimmer.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah,
that was,
That's what happened in Riley too.
I swam in there again.
yeah, that's good. It's great. Good. Yeah, that's why we're doing it. Yep. But you see, even from the spring and the fall, we're seeing reductions in that sediment phosphorus release because we're in the early part of the season. It's still converting phosphorus to aluminum-bound phosphorus. Okay. So to me, what this says is, yeah, it might be stirring up the sediment and the alum, but it's not changing the effectiveness of it because it's kind of going in the water column. It's still not available and it's settling back down. It's still suppressing the release of phosphorus out of those sediments in a beneficial way. So the real question is, how long will this last now? Right? It's one thing to say, okay, it's working in the year following the treatment. It's another thing to say, what's it going to do at 5 years and 10 years? So you'll have to keep on top of monitoring it to look at that effectiveness to understand this better.
And again, the point of this was not to say that, it's okay to wakeboat. The point of this is to say, is it still worth our expenditure as a district to do aluminum
Right.
treatment? So.
Right.
We have about 5 minutes before
I'm
our
done.
board meetings.
We don't even need to go through that one. So the last one.
We need to give everybody a 2-second break.
Yes, I know it's a lot. So really what we're saying is, we think there's sediment disturbance. We don't really think it's impacting internal loading at this point. We are going to do some statistical analysis to look at statistical differences just to kind of verify what we think we see visually in the data. And then we need to talk about whether total aluminum is the right measure moving forward. And we got to figure out that part of it.
Thank you.
So that's what we know about the wakeboat. Oh, one last thing is we are on a team with SAPL where they put in an LCCMR grant. We're waiting to hear funding, but we would be working with them to look at alum treatments and wakeboating and be a part of that research team. And I say we, meaning you too. We don't know yet. We're still waiting to hear if we get funded. So call your representative and tell them it's a good.
That was really workful.
That's it. I'm done. I promise.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
We have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Make good use of it.
Oh, thank
Who's going first?
you.
It's more water.